everybody, and on behalf of the Glastonbury Centre, thank you very much for coming here and thank you to this Marion, who's going to continue the pilgrimage journey to the University, Professor at the University of Oslo, and has done a lot of work, Glastonbury research, Glastonbury, and the pilgrimage. So, without further ado, I'd like to
Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm afraid this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some significant characters and events, and I'm fully aware that many people and events there just won't be time to mention, so forgive me. What an exciting place Glastonbury is. It's undoubtedly one of the most multifaceted pilgrimage sites in Britain. It's got this long history of drawing people to it, inspiring myth, speculation, and many would claim healing and transformation. However, while that might be said of any number of traditional pilgrimage destinations, perhaps the most striking feature of this small Somerset town is the extent to which it has acted and still acts as a magnet for an ever-increasing variety of pilgrims with varied forms of pilgrimage and multiple understandings of what pilgrimage might mean or might be. And because a range of people come to Glastonbury with assorted interests, aims, and expectations, a spectrum of pilgrimage activity is seen here, from more traditional Western Christian models, through interfaith pilgrimage, goddess pilgrimage, Celtic calendar-related activity, conference attendance, earth energy-inspired journeying, and virtual pilgrimage. And in addition, very much as Nick was saying this morning, like pilgrimage centres all over the world, a distinctive pilgrim economy or spiritual economy has developed to provide services, goods, infrastructure for its many and varied visitors. And this also, of course, provides opportunities for livelihoods for those who want to be in this special place. And it must be said, like many pilgrimage places, it has been, and on occasion still is, a site of contestation. Now, it's worth noting that while a lot of talk about new pilgrimage in Northern Europe is influenced by the enormous popularity of the Camino de Santiago de Compostela in Spain, this tends to stress the journey almost more than the destination, but that's only ever been part of the pilgrim story. It must be observed that in Glastonbury, the journey to Glastonbury is in many cases secondary to the journey within Glastonbury, because being in Glastonbury is what counts. But then, of course, Glastonbury's plethora of sacred sites, the Abbey, the Tor, Wiriol Hill, Chalice Well, White Spring, and so on, these all provide the settings for almost pilgrimages within this one pilgrimage site. Now, on days like this, with this wonderful cloud inversion, you can see why many people think of Glastonbury as the Isle of Avalon, emerging from the Somerset levels. So as we know, Glastonbury is this small town in the southwest of England that has drawn people to it for centuries, and those drawn to Glastonbury have frequently imbued it with enormous spiritual and increasingly global significance. It was described in the Middle Ages as the holiest earth in England, but by the late 20th century, it was being hailed as heart chakra of planet Earth. And I think this tells us something about the localization of global traditions and the globalization of local Glastonbury traditions. Particularly since the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Glastonbury has been attracting this huge variety of pilgrims, spiritual seekers, lifestyle experimenters, all visiting this same physical location, but potentially simultaneously experiencing there somewhat different or parallel story worlds. Now, when I use this term story world here, I'm talking about the way that worldviews, the way we see the world, the way we act in relation to it, to each other, and to other than human beings. These are all framed, informed, influenced, shaped by narratives. Narratives prime our sensory perceptions. They influence our responses to a place. They help us make sense of our experience. And in religious studies, I have to stress, myth is not a dismissive term. Rather, it's understood as a significant story. And one of the things that people living in, coming to, thinking about Glastonbury all do is to take stories seriously. Such is the awareness of the role of story and myth-making in Glastonbury that some people refer not to Glastonbury's history, but its mythstory. For myths, not simply dead history or fanciful narratives, in various ways do act in experientially rich, lived realities in this highly storied and restoried place. So what I want to do very briefly here is to explore the way that these story worlds lead to these parallel universes, which are created, enacted, and sustained on the ground in Glastonbury, and how pilgrimage has developed not only to competitively stake claims to Glastonbury, but increasingly to provide a sort of lingua franca, a common language, and a most useful and valuable vehicle through which differences can be expressed, but mutually respected and accommodated. Cannot note that the particularity of a place arises from the complexity of its social relations and the sum of stories about it. And this is an observation that in many ways encapsulates Glastonbury's attractions for a wide variety of residents, visitors, spiritual tourists, and pilgrims. Glastonbury's contemporary drawing power, as I've indicated, has at its heart a corpus of myths, distinctive natural landscape features, hills, wells, trees, built environment, the abbey, chapels, and so on, and since the early 20th century, a truly remarkable spiritual subculture. Now, while the more alternative aspects of spirituality in Glastonbury have been the headline grabbers, perhaps, it is important, as Nick was indicating this morning, to acknowledge that its distinctive vernacular Christian traditions have been key to Glastonbury's long-term and continuing significance. Glastonbury's Christian story world is very much centred nowadays on the myth that St. Joseph of Arimathea, the merchant who provided a tomb for Jesus, arrived in Glastonbury by sea shortly after the crucifixion and established in Glastonbury the earliest Christian church in England. Now, this myth of early pure Christianity arriving directly in England at Glastonbury has had and continues to have immense potency for a huge range of people. As you know, excuse me, Joseph allegedly stuck his staff in the ground on Wearyall Hill, and it took root to become the famous Glastonbury thorn, sports of which blossom both in spring and around Christmas to this day. So that whole package of myths relating to Joseph have been immensely potent. And of course, Joseph is also said to have had in his legendary luggage the chalice used at the Last Supper, which is credited by some with staining red the waters at Chalice Well, where some believe it remains hidden. Another variant on the Joseph legend has him bringing relics of the blood and sweat of Jesus. Now, in an interesting further development of this legend, there is the idea that perhaps Jesus himself came to Glastonbury before starting his ministry. And again, this is a hugely significant story for many people who feel that by coming to Glastonbury, they are literally walking in the footsteps of Jesus. And that, is undoubtedly one of its big attractions. Now, as we've heard, the alleged site of St. Joseph's Church eventually blossomed into Glastonbury Abbey, one of the largest and richest abbeys in England, a major medieval pilgrimage destination. But as we also heard, it was brutally suppressed in the 16th century as a result of the Reformation, and the abbey fell into ruins. And I've used here one of Reading University's reconstructions of Glastonbury Abbey, showing the Lady Chapel that Nick was talking about earlier, which was allegedly the site of that earliest church established by Joseph. Now, I think, as you see from the map, that this has left not entirely an empty space, but a space at the heart of Glastonbury. And it's often occurred to me that perhaps it's this space that's encouraged myth-making and diversity in Glastonbury. Anthropologists of religion, Eden Salno, talk about the power of a shrine deriving in large part from its character almost as a religious void, a ritual space capable of accommodating diverse meanings and practices, its capacity to absorb and reflect a multiplicity of religious discourses, to be able to offer a variety of clients what each of them desires. Now, of course, I'm not saying that the Abbey site is a religious void, far from it. But I do wonder whether the Abbey's ruined state and clear spaces have had an effect on the freer development of myths and practice in connection with Glastonbury, in contrast, for example, to Wells. Is this idea that people can come here and make of it a number of different things. So I think that's really quite important. And of course, it is, again, a site both for formal Anglican and Catholic pilgrimages, but also for many individual pilgrims on a range of spiritual journeys. But I do just quickly want to mention two significant 19th century events that often get overlooked. And that's the revival of pilgrimage to Glastonbury with the Catholic pilgrimage of 1895 and the Anglican pilgrimage of 1897. Now, we perhaps tend to forget what an immensely big deal the coming of the railway could be for a place. So when the Glastonbury branch of the Somerset and Dorset Railway was opened in 1854, a great celebratory procession was held, which interestingly wended its way through the Abbey grounds, at that point in private hands. You can't see perhaps the banners, but it says, "Where there's a rail, there's a way," and railways and civilization. Now, the coming of the railway to Glastonbury facilitated increased access to Glastonbury and also the resumption of large-scale formal pilgrimage to Glastonbury after a gap of over 300 years. So in 1895, pilgrims were able to travel from all over Britain to mark the beatification of the Glastonbury Catholic martyrs, Abbot Whiting and the monks Thorne and James. And then in 1897, the railway brought an unprecedented number of pilgrims and sightseers to Glastonbury for what was hailed as an international pilgrimage organised by the Anglican Church. So I just think it's as well to remember that this is happening in the late 19th century. So as Giles Mercer puts it, the Glastonbury pilgrimage in 1895 was among the first large-scale, legal, outdoor, public Catholic events in England since the Reformation, and the first in the southwest. Now, Glastonbury Station, this is them coming out of the station to head off on their long journey, because Glastonbury Station is on the edge of town, and they were wending their way right through town and ending up on top of the Tor. And what I think is quite interesting about this is that when they got up the Tor, obviously they were talking about the three Glastonbury martyrs, hymns were sung, prayers were said, and a sermon was preached. Whoops, why are we not? Thank you. And on the way down, some people stopped at the College of the Sacred Heart, Catholic College, at the foot of Glastonbury Tor, and you'll recognise some of the buildings of Chalice Well, but as well to remember there was a Catholic college there. And then they were able to return to Bath and Bristol by a special train. And estimates in the number vary from 1,500, those starting at the station, and maybe as many as 4,000 in the latter part of the pilgrimage. Now, it's important to note that participants and organisers of this pilgrimage did not know what sort of reception they might get, and they were genuinely apprehensive. And in fact, the Catholic Bishop of Clifton had a letter published in the Central Somerset Gazette in September 1895, in which he thanked the people of Glastonbury for the courteous and even respectful reception they gave us. And so that's quite significant. So this was a big deal. This was the first time in large number that an organised pilgrimage was taking place. That 1895 pilgrimage was followed by what I tend to think of as a retaliatory Anglican pilgrimage in 1897. In 1897, it was the 1300th celebrations of marking the arrival of St. Augustine in Kent in 597, the year generally considered to mark the founding of the English Church. The Lambeth Conference, the great gathering of the archbishops and bishops of the worldwide Anglican Communion, moved out of sequence for these celebrations, and they commenced with pilgrimage to Glastonbury. However, the Anglican Bishop of Bath and Wells also conceived the idea of an Anglican pilgrimage to Glastonbury, and he issued a letter of invitation to the bishops worldwide attending the celebrations and the Lambeth Conference, saying, "To some of us, it appears worthwhile to draw attention to the existence of the British Church in these islands before the arrival of St. Augustine and his companions, and to the connection of the Church of England with this church." And he noted that the owner of Glastonbury Abbey had kindly said that they could use the grounds. And I think it's interesting that the Church of England, which had so much at the time of the Reformation spurned the practice and material culture of pilgrimage, was ready now to embrace it again. And the Anglican pilgrimage was attempting to undermine Catholic claims by stressing the pre-existence and preeminence of Glastonbury before the arrival of Augustinian Catholicism. It was held on the site of the Abbey. It was an altogether grander, higher profile affair than the 1895 pilgrimage. I won't go through it all, but there we go. I just wanted to make the point that their procession was very much smaller. It went from St. John's Church round into the Abbey grounds. And if you're familiar historically with the Catholic and Anglican pilgrimages, these patterns of what land you walked were actually a leftover from that. Anyway, the Central Somerset Gazette reported the town was brightly decorated for the occasion, festoons of streamers spanned the principal streets, and the buildings were freely treated with flags and bunting and devices of an appropriate character. But the numbers are interesting again. Traffic was exceedingly heavy on all the local railway lines, about 4,000 people having thus reached the town, besides which several thousands arrived by road. Messrs. Cook, the world-renowned promoters of modern-day tours, brought between 2,000 and 3,000 visitors. So I just think it's worth making the point that you had this high-profile one, which was undoubtedly making a point, contesting Christian Glastonbury. But a subset of this was just how interesting it is that so many people wanted to come and see it. So already, I'm just saying, already in the late 19th century, pilgrimage was taking off. The idea had been set. The railways helped that. People were coming, and there was an idea that pilgrimage to Glastonbury was an appropriate thing to be reviving. But while, to some extent, Anglican and Catholic pilgrimages were contesting the site, by then Glastonbury was already the focus of far broader speculation about Glastonbury's past and more expansive visions of pilgrimage. Throughout the 20th century into the 21st century, Glastonbury was to be repeatedly restoried, new stories told about it, and in turn that led to the restoration of pilgrimage in a variety of forms. So the turn of the 19th into 20th century was a period of Celtic revival with burgeoning interest in Celtic art, culture and spirituality. Influential Breton scholar Ernest Renan had characterised the Celts as spiritual beings and visionary dreamers, claiming they had displayed an enlightened approach to the integration of paganism and Christianity. Meanwhile, interest in Druidry, renewed in the 18th century, was again continuing apace. And an important contribution to the spiritual milieu at that time was also being made by Theosophy. And among the ideas put forward by Blavatsky and her followers were the existence of ancient wisdom traditions, esoteric in character, but manifest through exoteric religious traditions, the existence of adepts or masters of such wisdom, the channeling of such wisdom to those attuned to receive it, a rather westernized understanding of reincarnation and karma, which portrayed a very positive view of spiritual progress, in every life a lesson, and the idea of humanity's spiritual as well as physical evolution. And so I think you can begin to see that ideas like this played out and developed in subsequent decades in society generally, and specifically in Glastonbury, as well as the influences of increasing contact with a greater range of different religious traditions relating to the Indian subcontinent, but also with the Baha'is. And at this point, so we've got all of this going on, late 19th, early 20th century. At this point, we see a number of remarkable events and people in Glastonbury, as excellently chronicled in The Avalonians by Patrick Benham. So John Arthur Goodchild, very much inspired by the Celtic revival, in his book The Light of the West, put forward the theory that ancient Ireland had been the centre of a cult venerating the female aspect of the deity, and he came to believe that a remnant of that cult had survived in Glastonbury, and it existed around the figure of St Bride and could furthermore be revived. Wesley Tudor Pole claimed that in 1902, at the age of 18, he had a vision in which it was revealed to him that in a previous existence he had been a monk at Glastonbury Abbey. And after this, he spent as much time as possible in Glastonbury, becoming very interested in Chalice Well and developing a pilgrimage route that included Bride's Well. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole story of the discovery around the vessel that some people believed to be the vessel used at the Last Supper, but it's important to note that Tudor Pole was most emphatically drawing on vernacular traditions of Glastonbury as the earliest site of Christianity in England, and he was highlighting to church leaders the importance of Glastonbury as a source of spiritual insight, and presenting at that time a vision for a spiritually united Christianity, a far more embracing version of Christianity for a new age. And with Alice Buckton, pioneering educationalist, poet, arts and crafts enthusiast and dramatist, she settled in Glastonbury in 1913 and lived at Chalice Well until just before her death in 1944. Very much influenced by Goodchild's ideas, and she was involved in a movement to bring about the spiritual renewal of Britain by reactivating sacred sites such as Iona in Glastonbury and in Ireland through pilgrimage. Alice bought Fairfield to donate to the National Trust in order to preserve the Pilgrim's Path to the Tor. She also purchased Chalice Well, and although financial difficulties led to its sale after her death, eventually Tudor Pole was able to establish the Chalice Well Trust in 1959, thus safeguarding the well as a place of pilgrimage. So both significant ideas and practical measures were put in place, if you see what I mean, for the expanding role of pilgrimage in Glastonbury. And it was all part of that bigger taking off point for what developed in the later 20th century. So if we think in turn about Glastonbury today, Glastonbury Tor dominates the town and the surrounding landscape and is an excellent example of what we now have as parallel perceptions. For Catholics, the site had been associated with the martyrdom of Whiting and his companions. For some people, coming to Glastonbury simply means climbing the Tor as their special place and to experience the special energies there, they feel. While traditionally some claimed the Tor as the entrance to the fairy realm, some came to believe that it houses a huge interplanetary communications centre. Some see in its contours a prehistoric ceremonial maze and the outline of the body of the goddess. And this is what I mean by the restoring and the parallel universes, as Glastonbury accrues more and more stories and interpretations to it. And of course, again, since the later 20th century, there's been an increasing interest in Glastonbury as a Celtic site, both a Celtic Christian site, but also a site of Celtic paganism, a place where the Celtic eightfold calendar would have been observed, people believe, so that by going to Glastonbury on these special days, and here we are at a special day, people can feel in continuity with distant ancestors, as well as feeling closer to nature. And so, do you see what I mean? It's going on and on and on. It's the same place, but more and more is accruing to it. We briefly heard about King Arthur earlier. Arthur had long been a character in Glastonbury's story world, and as we heard, the monks claimed to have found the bodies of Arthur and his queen in 1191, and this is the University of Reading reconstruction of the Grand Tomb that was built for these remains and was visited by Edward III and Queen Philippa in 1331. But of course the tomb disappeared with the 16th century Reformation. And again, it took off in the 20th century. Renewed interest in and reinterpretation of the Arthurian legend ranged from Dion Fortune's Avalon of the Heart, Geoffrey Ashe's Avalonian Quest, Marion Bradley's Mist of Avalon, which has been hugely influential in attracting people to Glastonbury. Some became convinced that the Grail legends were set in and around Glastonbury in the Glastonbury Zodiac, a huge landscape planisphere. And so many felt that they could come and pursue their own individual Grail quest in and around Glastonbury. And of course, Arthur became associated with for some people, with the New Age and the anticipation that the New Age of 2000 might even be a time when Arthur might reappear as a great spiritual leader rather than a military leader. I'm going to leave Kathy to talk about the revival of interest in the goddess in Glastonbury, but of course we have to note its significance for pilgrimage with the annual procession of the Goddess Conference, reclaiming and restoring sites associated with Christianity for the goddess, so the Chalice Well, the Tor, Weary Hill. Meanwhile, increasingly people have been narrating Glastonbury's century-old appeal in terms of lines of earth energies. Guy was talking about this morning to some extent. Ley lines of earth energies, which many believe converge at Glastonbury, making it a very powerful place, which has been drawing people, again, for millennia, for healing and spiritual growth. And these ley lines radiating out into the global landscape are said to confirm Glastonbury's status as, among other things, heart chakra of planet Earth. And of course, with increasing environmental and climate change awareness, the idea of interconnectedness is ever more important. You know, we're all in this together. So, since the latter part of the 20th century, there's been this huge, diverse group of pilgrims with different foci and motivations, telling different stories to explain its attraction, its sacrality, and its special nature. And changes to the nature of pilgrimage in Glastonbury are reflected in this quotation. The growing interest in sacred places has led to a modern awakening in the value of pilgrimage. In every age, there have been pilgrims travelling to the sacred sites and places of the world as an act of spiritual devotion to their particular creed. The difference now is that modern pilgrims visiting the sacred places are of many different beliefs and often of no belief. They don't necessarily come to be in touch with any specific divinity, but they come to be in the energies of the sacred places, and by being in these places, to understand themselves more clearly and to see their role in the world. So it's this idea of a huge expansion of what it might mean to be a pilgrim, as we've been hearing about earlier today. So like many sacred sites, Glastonbury has been and remains a site of contestation as people lay claim to it, narrate their version of it, and occasionally try to assert the superiority of their stories. But pilgrimage in Glastonbury has increasingly become recognised as a vehicle whereby people can experience their Glastonbury alongside others with different visions and narratives of Glastonbury's past, its significance in the present, and its role for the future. And numerous people in Glastonbury have donated time, skills, energy, resources to community initiatives and philanthropic pursuits beyond their own spiritual paths and enterprises. And a strong sense of selfless service has emerged in many of the interviews I've conducted since the early 1990s, such as those frequently found at pilgrimage sites, and I can see John laughing. Oh, right. Sorry. So, I will race on here. So there are pilgrims and other visitors to Glastonbury who feel drawn to the place, often repeatedly and regularly, and who feel enervated and renewed by being here, but who are nevertheless happy to return home from it. However, some feel that they simply have to stay. And among the many who have felt called to Glastonbury have been members of the Glaston Group. And in its booklet, Glastonbury, A Pilgrim's Perspective, the Glaston Group describes itself as an eclectic and evolving group with a diverse range of beliefs and interests. We too were drawn here as pilgrims in search of truth and the sacred. While some pilgrims come and go and return again, we put down our roots and stayed. And I think, as we heard earlier, the people who came originally as pilgrims and felt they had to stay, as residents, a number of them have worked very hard to develop what they see as a new phase of Glastonbury's destiny as a pilgrimage place for the 20th century, but reframing and representing, as it were, representing what pilgrimage might look like. And as we heard earlier, in 2007, a long-held dream of the Glaston Group was realised with the opening of the Glastonbury Pilgrim Reception Centre, known as the PRC. It was established, though it's moved around various locations in town, and operates with the definition of pilgrim simply as one who makes a journey to a sacred place. And so its aim was to actively help build Glastonbury as a centre of pilgrimage for people of all faiths and beliefs, and to offer a range of services to pilgrims, visitors, residents and researchers, including teaching, information and support. And I'm just going to skip this. Now, for many years, there was a real divide between, and this is something John touched on at the start of the day, between the information provided in the Tourist Information Office, which really shunned or ignored the growing alternative and spiritual scene, and those who recognised the need to embrace the diversity of visitors to Glastonbury, from heritage tourists to spiritual seekers. And the fact that they are now both housed in the same building is seen by many as a more realistic, respectful and conciliatory way forward. And again, I don't want to take too much time, but I would say that also within the PRC and the Glaston group, which actually one can't not mention. There are so many people to mention in the Glastonbury group and the people who have helped make the PRC happen, but we have to mention Barry Taylor, Elizabeth, as we heard earlier, and Morgana West. And one of the great projects has been this idea of the Glastonbury Unity Candle and promoting the idea of unity in diversity. So encouraging pilgrims of all kinds, saying, yes, of course, we have different paths, but also encouraging a respectful unity in diversity. And that, if you care to see the candle, Morgana is downstairs today with the candle. So, something importantly that has developed during the pandemic that you'll hear more of today is the Glastonbury Way, a 7-mile waymarked path in and around Glastonbury, which again attempts to cater for people of a variety of worldviews, for a spectrum of visitors, weaving together different story worlds and enabling people to enjoy the landscape in different ways, from a simple ramble in nature to a meditative walk, from those walking in the footsteps of Jesus to those physically experiencing the body of the goddess, and so on. And as Lawrence Taylor says, the plasticity and relative malleability of pilgrimage, the space often leaves for individual and collective agency, and its ambiguous character as religious or secular activity, all contribute to making it a uniquely potent way of maintaining or asserting a moral geography that reconfigures the world for personal and collective purposes. Now, that's not something that perhaps PRC would have said, but it's this recognition of the huge fluidity, diversity, encompassing nature of pilgrimage that we are seeing again and again in Glastonbury, and is one of the things that makes it most special. So, a huge variety of pilgrims, spiritual seekers, and lifestyle experimenters visit this same physical location, Glastonbury, but might simultaneously experience different or parallel story worlds. But stories become powerfully embedded, not simply in people's minds and lifestyles, but in landscapes. The metaphysical and the physical interact, creating on-the-ground realities. Glastonbury has been and continues to be restoried, with pilgrimage a vehicle that allows people to express different story worlds and to physically interact with them, because, of course, pilgrimage is an embodied practice. But such stories empower individuals and groups. They confirm identities and worldviews, give meaning to the past, and provide a narrative thread for the future. So I would contend that the new Glastonbury Way is just the latest development of the ways in which pilgrimage in Glastonbury has been and is being restored and restoried for our times. Thank you. Thanks. Oh, sorry, gone on.
Thank you very much, Marion. That was really, really interesting. And first note, thank you very much. We've got a little bit of time now for questions, so whatever you'd like to ask, any questions? John.
I couldn't help notice on the list of the pilgrims in 1897, before the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Vicar of Leeds. Why is it a bishop of this, bishop of that, Vicar of Leeds?
I actually suspect, although I don't know this for sure, that this was probably one of the dog's bodies doing a lot of the organisational work. I suspect. But no, I couldn't tell you why the Vicar of Leeds has such prominence in amongst that great and glorious gathering of dignitaries. Yeah. One of the things that I think is interesting about those two pilgrimages in the 19th century, the Catholic pilgrimage, they couldn't get anywhere for their clergy to robe up, so they had to have a special railway carriage to do it. They were not able to get anyone to give them space to do that. Whereas, of course, the Anglican pilgrims, the processional pilgrims, as it were able to robe up in St. Benedict's and in St. John's Church. So I think that edginess of that first Catholic pilgrimage was very real. And as I say, they were actually genuinely fearful. They didn't know what sort of reception they would get, and they were pleasantly surprised at the respect they were shown. So I think that also says something about perhaps a memory of pilgrimage in the town, maybe.
You talked about the 1890s and referred again to the pleasant surprise. Was there any room at that time, the kind of inclusivity that you say is now transformed? And did they acknowledge any of the pagan or other interests in the site?
No, and I think that's what's interesting. So you've got this sudden revival, if you like, of formal pilgrimage to Glastonbury, but actually what are they doing? They're looking inward. They're saying, no, Glastonbury's mine, no, Glastonbury's mine. So that's going on, but at the same time, you've got people like Tudor, you've got various visionaries who at one level considered themselves Christian, like Tudor, like Alice Buckton, but with a very much grander and broader vision of what Christianity might be, and beyond that, with a very much broader vision of Glastonbury's past, the relationships between paganism and Christianity, the importance of the Celtic period, and so on and so forth. So again, that's where I think you're starting to see these parallel universes, because people are saying, wait a minute, there's something going on here. We can rediscover a past. We can, make something happen and choose a different story from that simply of the Christian story of Glastonbury. This was all going on simultaneously. Yeah. Well, what was going on in the 1890s was a real testing of the boundaries of the Toleration Act. And so that is when more and more Catholics were becoming aware of pilgrimage, and also there was a real interest in physically revisiting places like Canterbury, Walsingham, Glastonbury, the great medieval shrines. But this formal organisation, so it was waiting, as I say, until the Acts of Toleration, when they were, as I say, so that 1880s, 1890s is when this is developing. As to whether pilgrimage was banned, obviously people had done other pilgrimage type activity, but the point at the Reformation, when pilgrimage was simply condemned, its material culture, its rationale, and so on, that stayed ascendant, if you like, as an outlook in various parts of the British Isles, like in Scotland and in England, where, so the infrastructure, the material culture, it was just trashed. And those traditions went, although, of course, many would argue that some of these traditions did stay on locally and were carried on as sort of cultural or local traditions, but not as part of a bigger movement of pilgrimage. Yep.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, Marion, once again, thank you very, very much for a tremendously interesting presentation.
Thank you.